my beautiful friends, it's Amanda here, and today I'm going to be comparing two eyeshadow palettes that I think are very, very similar. I'm talking about the new Tartelette Toasted and the new ColourPop Double Entendre palettes. Before I do anything else, before I give you any product info, I just want to show you these two palettes side by side. When you look at the layout, they each have 12 shades, and even the way those 12 shades are laid out is very, very similar. Before we get to the swatches and everything else, I just want to give you some product info about these palettes. Whether you're trying to decide which one to purchase or if you're just trying to decide if they're dupes, I think that this information is really important. The Tartelette Toasted palette retails for $46 US. The Double Entendre palette retails for $16 US. You are getting more eyeshadow in the Tarte palette. As you can see here, the back of my palette says that each pan in the Double Entendre palette is 0.085 grams. The ColourPop website says that it's 0.85 grams. Either way, you're getting more eyeshadow in the Tartelette Toasted palette. So when you're considering whether these palettes are dupes or not, just keep in mind that there is more product in the Tartelette Toasted palette by almost double. These are things you really have to keep in mind throughout the rest of this video. When it comes to packaging, these two palettes are basically the exact same size. The Tarte palette, however, is in a heavy-duty plastic and it has a locking clasp closure. It also has a mirror. The ColourPop palette is in a heavy-duty cardboard. It has a magnetic closure and there is no mirror. Neither of these palettes come with a brush or an applicator of any kind. We already looked at the shade layout in these palettes, and as you can see for yourself, it's very, very similar. There is one major difference as far as the shades go, and then there's one more minor difference. So I'm going to point those out to you now. The Toasted palette has 6 mattes, then it has 1 satin, 4 shimmers, and then 1 very glittery shade. The ColourPop palette has 7 mattes, it has 3 shimmers, 1 satin, and 1 very glittery shade. So the major difference is that the ColourPop palette has 1 extra matte and 1 less shimmer shade. I also mentioned that there was a minor difference, and it's this shimmery shade that's in the corner. It's in the same spot in both palettes. Shocker, I know. In the ColourPop palette, this is very smooth and it feels and performs just like the other shimmers in this palette, whereas in the Tarte Toasted palette, this shade is quite thick and almost chunky. It almost has a glitter feel to it. It still does swatch like a very metallic shimmer shade. It does not have actual glitters in it like this shade does. But the texture of this one just feels different than these other shimmers in the palette, whereas in the ColourPop one, that similar shade has the same texture. Hopefully I explained that well enough that it made sense. Next, I'm going to show you some comparison swatches of these two palettes. I just did finger swatches. However, after the swatches, I will show you a quick tutorial where I use both palettes, one on each eye. That way you can see how these shades perform with a brush as well. Can you guess which palette is on which eye? Can you tell? I mean, I really think that this eye look looks exactly the same. Now that you've seen the swatches, let's get to the tutorial so that you can see both of these palettes in action side by side. I'm gonna use the same eye base on both eyes. Obviously, I'm using my favorite. It's the MAC Painterly Paint Pot on both eyelids, and then I'm gonna set that eye base using the cream colored matte shade from each palette. I do want to point out that in addition to using the same eye base, I'm gonna be using the same brush for both eye looks, and I'm just gonna clean off in between each shade using my Veramona color switch. That way everything is as consistent as possible when we compare these two eye looks. I'm not going to walk through every single step of this eye look just because I want the shades to really speak for themselves. That's really the point. It's not so much the tutorial as just seeing how they work side by side. But I will say that this Tarte shade in particular, Fireside, was much more pigmented than its ColourPop counterpart, and I think that was apparent in the swatches as well. Cleaning my brush again. Yep, I'm gonna be doing that a lot in this video. I really wanted to use as many shades and as many different finishes as possible from this palette, so I did end up using 7 out of the 12 shades, and I think that gives us a pretty good idea of how these palettes compare to each other. Can we also take a moment to talk about these ColourPop shade names? They are a little too ridiculous even for me. And I don't mind a good pun, a dirty joke every now and then, a double entendre if you will, but these shade names are too much even for me. I have to say, when it comes to a silly little difference like shade names, I really prefer the overall theme of the Tartelette Toasted palette. I mean, come on. Nip slip? Really? That's not even a double entendre. There's no ambiguity of meaning there. That only means one thing. It means nip slip. That's not a double entendre. It's just dirty. I didn't tell my husband that I had these 2 different palettes on my eyes, and when he came home from work, I'd been wearing these eyeshadows for a few hours, and I asked him which eye looked better, and he said they looked exactly the same except for this lid shade had worn off more on the Tarte side. I do tend to agree with him, but I wanted an unbiased opinion, and I think that's probably due to the fact that the Tarte shadows are a lot softer, so they probably wear off a little easier. Here's the finished look from both palettes. You can decide for yourself, but I think the end result is pretty much identical when using either one of these palettes. You're gonna get the same look. That's my personal opinion, but I would love to hear what you think about how these 2 palettes work. Now that you've seen the eye look, you know you can get some very extremely similar looks out of each of these palettes. Do I think they're exact dupes? It just depends on how picky you are about something being a dupe. There is one shade that is very different. Personally, I think that the Tarte Toasted palette is just a little bit more pigmented. The shadows are a little bit softer. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I am a huge fan of the ColourPop palettes. By no means do I think that this is a bad palette. I do think that the pigmentation is great. I won't even say it's great for a $16 palette. I think it's just great, period. If I have to be really picky, I would say the Tarte Toasted palette is just a little bit better when it comes to shadow quality. We have to talk about packaging. The ColourPop palettes have a lot more pared down packaging. It boils down to personal preference if something like having a mirror and having the sturdier outer packaging is really a deal breaker for you. I've done quite a bit of traveling with my ColourPop palettes. I do think that they are more than sufficient for traveling. Even though this is cardboard and it doesn't have the locking clasp, I haven't had any issues with my palettes getting damaged while I traveled, but it's undeniable this packaging is sturdier, it is stronger, it has the mirror. I think this packaging is just a little tiny bit better. When it comes to that one shade that's different, I prefer the Tarte Toasted palette having an extra shimmer instead of the extra matte that's in the ColourPop palette. I just think that both of those light matte shades are really similar. I personally don't need both of them. However, that kind of balances out because the shimmer shade that I talked about, this one that's in the corner here on both palettes, I much prefer the formula of this shadow over the one that's in the same spot in the Toasted palette. So those two differences really kind of cancel each other out, for me anyway. I do tend to prefer the Toasted palette. I think it just depends on your budget and also how badly you want to earn those Ulta or Sephora points. If you're all about that point earning life, then Toasted's probably worth it for you. Basically, if you already have one, you definitely don't need to buy the other. If you're on a budget, you are not gonna be disappointed with the ColourPop palette. I'm definitely gonna be keeping both in my collection. I'm gonna be using both, loving both, and recommending both. Let me know which one you prefer. Do you have either one of these palettes? Leave a comment and let us know what you think. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye. Really? Of course I bought both of them. Because I have no self-control. Let's just pretend I bought them to make this video. But I didn't realize they were basically exactly the same palette until after I bought it. Oops. Blah, 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 blah. Have you ever talked before? Pretty sure that's a yes. Talk about the price difference. Huh? What? I don't know what to say. I bought both and I like both, but obviously I like both. I liked it the first time I bought it. What can I say? I really wanted to get more filming done today, but instead I'm just sitting here staring at these eyeshadows, drinking Coke Zero. Just a regular day in my life. Sad but true.